I'm Elizabeth with UAB Institute for Arts and Medicine. I hope you're well. And I'm going to tell you a story today, a really beautiful story. But before that, I have a question for us to ponder. Here it is. There's no question mark at the end. There really probably should be a ... But here's the question. An act of love we can all do. So I'm going to let us ponder that and tell you the story, and then we'll come back to this question and see what we've come up with. So I invite you to get comfortable. Maybe that means closing your eyes, or maybe you want to watch me. Either way, and here we go. Once upon a time, long, long ago, there lived a quilt maker. And she had a tiny cabin on the side of a mountain. And in this cabin, she made quilts day by day. And the whites of her quilts were so white. They glistened. And people thought somehow maybe she traveled to the Arctic and gathered some of the snow for inspiration. And the oranges and the pinks and the fuchsias were so lush and vibrant that people thought maybe she knew of a mountain of wildflowers somewhere that nobody else had been to. And the blues were like the wings of bluebirds and the blue of the sky. And some people said, well, you know, she doesn't even make those quilts. She's a witch, and she just conjures them up. And other people said, no, that's not what happens. She's actually an angel, and she has friends who fly by and drop quilts from their wings as they go. Well, neither of those things was true. The quilt maker did make the quilts, and as soon as she finished one, she would travel down the mountain, find someone who looked cold or lonely, wrap the quilt around their shoulders, and then tiptoe away, go back up the mountain, and the next morning start on another quilt. Well, her quilts, as we know, were so beautiful that many people climbed the mountain, pockets bursting with gold, asking to buy a quilt. But the quilt maker would not sell them. She said, my quilts are for those who are poor and lonely. Well, at the time of the quilt maker, there also lived a king. And this king, he wasn't a bad man, not at all, but he was very unhappy. And he thought somewhere on this earth there was something that would make him happy. So he passed a law that his birthday was to be celebrated every month on the 21st. So he had 12 birthdays a year, plus Christmas. And on each of these birthdays, the king demanded that everyone in his kingdom above age 5 bring him a gift. Now, there was no Dollar Tree at the time, but if there had been, the king would not have accepted gifts from there. Oh no, he liked gifts that were expensive and well thought out and perhaps handmade. So over the years, his palace came to be full of glistening, shiny things, coats and scarves and socks and handmade boots and belts and every kind of trinket you could imagine. And the king would walk around and look at all of his things and say, someday I will find something that will make me happy. Well, one of the king's soldiers loved the king and saw through his gruff exterior and saw through his unhappiness to his good heart. And the soldier was always on the lookout for something that would make the king happy. And he heard about the quilt maker. And he thought, maybe one of her quilts. Maybe that would be it. Maybe that would make the king happy. And he told the king about the quilt maker, and the king said, let's go. So they marched up the mountain to the quilt maker's cabin, and the king, who had been taught very good manners, completely forgot them. He didn't even knock on her door. He just opened the door, came in, and the quilt maker looked up from sewing, and the king said, give me that quilt. Well, the quilt maker looked at him with her big blue eyes, and she looked up and down at the king, and she did something you're never, ever, ever supposed to do it to a king. She laughed. Oh my goodness, she said, "No, my quilts are for the poor and the needy and the lonely, and I can easily see you are none of those." Well, the king, you know how kings are. They're used to getting what they want. And when they ask for something, people just hand it over. So the king said, "Well, I want it." And the quilt maker said, "Well, I'm sorry, but you can't have it." And the king then tried to snatch the quilt out of her very hands. But the quilt maker, who didn't look very fast, but she was, threw the quilt out the window, and it flew away on a passing cloud. Well, the king got very angry at that point, and he said, "If you don't give me a quilt, I'm going to march you down this mountain and chain you to the cave of a sleeping bear." And the quilt maker said, I'm sorry, but I can't give you a quilt." So she was marched down the mountain and chained to the cave of a sleeping bear. Well, soon that sleeping bear woke up, and he saw the quilt maker standing there at the entrance to his cave. And he stretched, and he got up on his hind legs and stretched up his front legs, and he said, so loudly that the quilt maker's teeth chattered and her bones rattled. But she looked at the bear and she said, "I know why you're so grumpy, especially when you first wake up. It's because you have nothing to lay your head on but hard rocks. Go fetch me some pine straw, and I will make a pillow for you out of my apron." Well, the bear, nobody had ever offered to make him a pillow before, so he went off, and he got pine straw, and he came back, and he broke the iron bracelet, and the quilt maker made him a pillow out of her apron. And the bear was so pleased with it that he sat right down and invited the quilt maker to breakfast. They had blackberries and honey. Well, while they were enjoying getting to know each other, the poor king was tossing and turning. He thought, "Oh my goodness, what have I done?" And he came running back to the cave. And when he saw the quilt maker having breakfast with the bear, he forgot all about feeling worried and sad, and he got mad all over again. And he said, "I want a quilt." And the quilt maker said, "Well, if you give away everything that you own, I will make a quilt for you." The king said, "I can't do that." And the quilt maker said, "Well, then I can't give you a quilt." Well, he got mad all over again, and this time he marched the quilt maker out to the sea, to an island no bigger than a cereal bowl. And he made her stand on that island on her tippy toes. And he said, "When the tide comes in, it will wash you out to sea, unless you give me a quilt." And she said, "I cannot do that." So the king left, and the quilt maker stood there on the tiny island, looking at the sky, and watching the clouds and feeling the wind start to whip up. And then she heard someone singing. And it was a little sparrow, and the sparrow was battling against the wind. So the quilt maker called. And the sparrow battled her way to the quilt maker, and the quilt maker scooped her up in her scarf and held her close to her heart and warmed the little bird with her breath. And after the storm passed, the quilt maker let the sparrow go, and she flew and she told all her friends about the quilt maker on the little island. Well, soon the sky was dark with sparrows, and they came and they picked the quilt maker up in their little beaks, and they flew her to their favorite tree, where she sat making capes for all of them. Well, as peaceful as that scene was, oh, the king, oh, the poor king, oh, he's thinking, what did I do? I may have drowned an old woman, and he came running back to the sea. But before he got there, he heard all this chitter-chattering up in a tree, and he looked, and there was the quilt maker with all the sparrows sewing capes for them. He said, okay, I give up. What must I do for you to make me a quilt? And she said, I told you, if you give away all the things that you own, then I will make a quilt for you. I will make a piece for everything that you give away. And the king said, I can't. I cannot do that. I don't give things away. I take things. And the quilt maker said, but if you have all these things and they don't make you happy, what good are they? Well, the king had to think about that. And he thought, and he thought, and he thought some more. And finally he said, okay, I'll give all my things away. And he went home and he searched high and low for something he could bear to give away. And finally he found a blue marble. And he went out into the street and he gave it to a boy. Well, the boy had never had a blue marble. And he ran and showed all his friends. So the king went back in and he got some scarves and he passed them out to people who looked cold. And the people were so thrilled with their scarves, they tossed them over their shoulders and they showed everyone what they had. Well, that was enough to get the king to go back inside and get all the handmade velvet coats. And the people who got the coats started a parade. And then he got the merry-go-round with the real horses. And a little girl with golden red hair grabbed his hand and twirled the king around. And for the first time in years, he smiled. And then he called to his soldiers, bring it out, bring it all out. So they brought out cart after cart, wagon after wagon. And soon the king was traveling the earth, giving things away. All the while, the quilt maker was making his quilt. And one day, a sparrow flew into her window and landed on her hand. And she knew that the king had given away everything. So she put the last stitches into the quilt, rolled it up, and went down the mountain in search of the king. Well, she saw a man whose toes were poking out of his boots. He was a little dirty. He was smiling and he was laughing. And she realized it was the king. And she went to him and wrapped the quilt around his shoulders. And he looked at her and smiled and he said, what's this? She said, what's this? Don't you remember? This is your quilt. I made it for you to give you when you became poor and needy. And he said, me poor? Me needy? Are you kidding? I am the richest man on earth. I am bursting with all the love that has been given to me for all the things that I gave away. I need nothing. I have never been so happy. And the quilt maker said, well, this is still for you. And he thanked her. And a great friendship was born. And thereafter, when the quilt maker finished a quilt, the king would fetch it, and he would take it and wrap it around someone who was cold and lonely. And he was never so happy as when he was giving something away. The end. So now, I'd like to return to our question. Do you remember what it was? An act of love we can all do. So you just did it. It's so many things. It is so many things. A smile, a hug, a wave, a thought, a good thought, and listening. Thank you so much for listening.